Good evening. On behalf of the Ascension Parish Library, I want to thank you all for joining us. Our guest this evening is an associate professor of history and women's, gender, and sexuality studies at Louisiana State University. She's also an affiliate professor of African and African American studies. Her research and publications focus on social movements, LGBTQ history, and sexual and gender-based violence. Please help me to welcome Dr. Catherine Jacquet.
Yay! Thanks so much, Christopher. It's such a pleasure to be here. So I want to thank you, Chris. This is Christopher Achi. Did I just say that right? Achi?
Ashe, but close enough.
Ashe. You had just told me. I'm so sorry. Ashe. And the Ascension Parish Public Library for inviting me to talk tonight. And I was really excited to know that they were doing programming around the 19th Amendment, and it's the 100-year commemoration. So it's really a pleasure to be here. So I hope some of you are ready to talk, because I've got questions for you, and I'm going to be asking for volunteers to read passages as we go through the lecture. Okay, we've practiced everybody raising hands, so we know how to do that, and people are muted, so we're good to go. So I'm going to share my screen. And let's see, we'll get the presentation started. Okay, so I assume everybody can see the stream. Chris, you can see my screen. It's my full screen presentations now. Okay, perfect. Okay, everybody. So the title of my talk tonight is Right to Vote, and the question mark is on purpose. We'll talk a little bit about why. 100 years since women's suffrage. I want to trouble this idea about the 19th Amendment and what it meant, what it did, and did it actually give the right to vote? But we're going to get to that. So first, I just want to define our terms before we get started. So I assume everybody knows what the suffrage is, but who wants to tell us what suffrage means? Somebody raise their hand. I think I should be able to see it if you raise your hand. Is anybody raising their hand? Oh, Elizabeth Collins. How would you define suffrage?
I would say suffrage is the opportunity to be recognized as a voter.
Okay, sorry, I just did that, a mistake. Yes, absolutely right. So suffrage is the right to vote in political elections, right? Thank you. Who can define enfranchisement? What does that mean? Or, well, think about what is the franchise? That's a word that's used, the franchise. Any guesses? All right, well, I'm just gonna tell y'all. So the franchise, sometimes we use it like for the vote, the franchise. So enfranchisement is the giving of a right or a privilege. So in our context tonight, we're gonna be talking about the right to vote, and it's typically used to talk about the right to vote. And then disfranchisement is gonna be the denial, the opposite of that, the denial of a right or a privilege. And in our context tonight, it's typically used in terms of the denial of the right to vote, but you can also talk about people being economically or socially disfranchised. So disfranchisement is the noun, the verb is to disenfranchise. I will probably flip those and mistake those while I'm talking, because I always forget when you have the EN or not. But anyway, so that's what that means. So just to make sure that we're all on the same page in terms of the terms that we're using. So tonight's talk, the bulk of my talk is going to be focusing on a series of letters that were sent to Louisiana Senator Edward J. Gay between 1918 and 1919, as he was deciding whether or not to vote in favor of the women's suffrage bill. And we're going to be taking a look at some of the arguments for and against women's suffrage to give us an understanding of what people thought in the early 20th century about who should have the right to vote and why. And these documents tell us a great deal about the leading beliefs on race and gender at the time. And they give us a very clear sense of what people believed was at stake with this amendment. But before we get to those letters, I'm going to start with a comment on the 19th Amendment. We're going to talk about what it actually said and what it actually did. So the 19th Amendment, as you all know, was ratified by Congress. Was ratified when the required 36 states approved it, and it was adopted in 1920. So what did the 19th Amendment say? Don't try to read the screen. What does it say? Like if somebody asked you, what was the 19th Amendment? What would you say? I need a volunteer. So somebody raise your hand, take a stab at it. Well, you're all here tonight, so you must have a kind of a clue of what the 19th Amendment says. Yes, Mildred.
It gave everybody the right to vote.
Okay, and who specifically?
Women.
Okay, that's right. So we typically tend to think, oh, the 19th Amendment, it gave women the right to vote. But it doesn't actually say that. So that's why I think it's interesting to read the actual language of the amendment. So can I have a volunteer to read the screen for us? Okay, Joyce, please.
The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation.
Thank you so much. So what do you all note? Does anything strike you, Joyce, or anybody about the wording of this amendment? Does it say women have the right? Elizabeth Collins.
Well, no, it doesn't really even give a right. It just says what you can't do.
That's right, right? So what's so interesting about this amendment is it doesn't say, it's not written as a positive, right? It's written as a negative. So it says the vote cannot be denied on account of sex, which means it can still be denied on account of a bunch of other things, even if you're a woman. Okay, so, oops, hold on, there we go. So the wording is, oops, what's that? Oh, I thought somebody started talking. So the wording of this amendment is critically important because voting has never been a guaranteed right in this country. People have had to fight tough, long-term battles for access to the franchise. And an honest national history of voting in the United States is actually best told as a history of disfranchisement, voter denial, and voter suppression. Universal suffrage was never guaranteed, and it's still not guaranteed. And we'll talk about today in a little bit. So millions of women were actually kept from the polls following the 19th Amendment. So we might ask ourselves, like, how is that possible? Because the 19th Amendment passed. So how is it that millions of women still can't vote? So let's look at some different methods of disfranchisement. And as you all will remember from earlier, disfranchisement, right, means the denial of the right to vote. So various ways that folks were kept from the polls. You had poll taxes. So you had to pay a fee to be able to vote. Literacy tests. And these literacy tests, I have an example here from the state of Louisiana. This is a 1963 literacy test. So as you can see, none of the questions asked actually test your literacy. They're the completely absurd questions. Like the second one, draw a line under the last word in this line. None of this is actually testing literacy. It's just it's a completely absurd test. And this is an actual test that was given to Louisiana residents, and I should say Black residents in Louisiana in the 1960s. Residency requirements, so folks had to live in an area for a particular amount of time before they could vote. Fear or intimidation was also a very effective way to keep people away from the polls, threats of violence. The location of polling places. If there's no polling place within 50 miles of where you live, you're not going to vote. So, right, okay. So this idea of disfranchisement and thinking about the 19th Amendment, I want to be very clear that the 19th Amendment did not give all women the right to vote, and many were still denied the right to vote or denied access to the vote on account of class, race, or ethnicity. So a few examples of women who could not vote after the 1920 includes millions of Asians and Mexican American women in the West, as well as Native American women across the country who were denied suffrage until the 1940s, or sometimes even later. Southern Black women, as well as Southern Black men, were effectively denied suffrage until the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which I will be talking more about. So if we're going to look specifically at Native American women, the 19th Amendment did not apply to Native American women. So first, it's not until 1924 that we get the passage of the Indian Citizenship Act. And this act admitted Native Americans born in the United States to full citizenship. But that's already 4 years after the 19th Amendment. Now, citizenship, though, does not guarantee voting rights. So in a 1928 case in Arizona, Porter v. Hall, the court ruled that Native Americans could not vote because they were, quote, under the guardianship of the government. So the court in its decision wrote, no person under guardianship, non corpus mentis, there's my attempt at Latin, or insane shall be qualified to vote at any election. So Native Americans did not get the right to vote in New Mexico or Arizona until 1948, and that was following lawsuits that they, put forth on their own behalf. Many other states continued to bar Native Americans from the vote. So it's going to take until 1965 with the Voting Rights Act that I know I keep mentioning, but I'll talk more about, for most Native Americans to get voting rights in this country. And Utah and Maine were some of the last states to recognize Native American voting rights. Puerto Rican women also did not get the right to vote with the 19th Amendment. So Congress had made all Puerto Ricans citizens in 1917. But as we know, citizenship does not guarantee the right to vote. Puerto Rico is a US colony, and the 19th Amendment did not apply to US colonies. So Puerto Rican women had to fight tooth and nail for the vote. The legislature, the Puerto Rican legislature, which was of course all men, finally gave women the right to vote in 1929, but there was a caveat there. Only those who could read and write, so only literate women, were given the vote in 1929. Those literacy requirements were finally removed in 1935 after years of strikes and protests by Puerto Rican women workers. So universal women's suffrage in Puerto Rico is not until 1935. That's 15 years after the 19th Amendment is passed. When we look at Southern Black women, they're going to be the largest contingent who was barred from the polls after the passage of the 19th Amendment. So in the Jim Crow South, whites used extreme measures to suppress the Black vote. So on paper, Black women could vote, but in reality, they could not exercise that right until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Voting Rights Act was what many have called the crown jewel of the civil rights movement. It prohibited racial discrimination in voting, and it was a critical safeguard in ensuring access to the ballot, or I should say equal access to the ballot, and it guaranteed the fundamental right to vote. It's often held up as the most effective civil rights legislation ever passed. It enabled the enfranchisement of millions of minoritized voters, and by diversifying the electorate, it therefore also diversified legislative bodies at all levels of American government. So as far as voting for Southern Black women, we're talking 45 years after the passage of the 19th Amendment before they could actually access that right to vote. So all of this to say is it's not accurate to say that with the 19th Amendment, women get the right to vote. What is accurate to say is that with the 19th Amendment, women could not be denied the right to vote on account of their sex. And I know that's a mouthful, but we need to be honest about what this amendment actually did, which doesn't mean that it wasn't critically important and that the long and arduous struggle for the vote was not absolutely worth it. But if we say women get the vote in 1920, it suggests that number one, they all did, which we know they didn't, so that's not true. And it also suggests number two, that that's the end of the story, But 1920 is actually the middle of the story. Arguably, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is just as important to the story of women's suffrage as the 19th Amendment is. And that's not the end of the story either. I mean, the story doesn't end in 1965. The story, in fact, continues to this present day as we continue to battle against voter suppression across gender, race, and class. So the issue of voting rights is and will continue to be a major social justice issue of our time. So just to give you a brief history of women's suffrage, it is a long and complicated tale with roots in the abolitionist movement. What is the abolitionist movement? What does that mean? What am I talking about? Who wants to raise their hand? What did people want to abolish in the 19th century? Yes, Joyce.
Slavery.
That's right.
Slavery.
Exactly, right? So it was the movement to abolish slavery. So that's where you find the roots of the women's suffrage movement. And the battle for women's suffrage lasted over 70 years until the 19th Amendment was finally passed in 1920. And as we know, that's not the end of the story. So women's suffrage was a long-term campaign that had many different stakeholders. Women protested, they paraded, they picketed in front of the White House, they were incarcerated, they endured violence and incredible brutality while they were incarcerated, all in the name of suffrage. So we want to ask ourselves, why did they have to do all of this? What is it that drove people to either reject or support women's suffrage? And why did people care so much? So that's going to take us to the main focus of tonight's talk, which are our historical documents. Okay, so when it came to women's suffrage, a lot was at stake. So to understand this, we're going to take a look at some of the arguments for and against the women's suffrage bill prior to the passing of the 19th Amendment. And these arguments are going to reveal not just beliefs about who made up the body politic, but also deep-seated beliefs about gender and gender norms and race and the racial caste system in the United States. And so through these documents, we can learn about people's hopes and fears and how people understood the world. So in 1918 and 1919, Louisiana Senator Edward J. Gay had to decide whether to vote for or against the women's suffrage bill. Gay's constituents in Louisiana, as well as people in other states, sent him letters, petitions, flyers, essays, telegrams, trying to sway his opinion on the suffrage issue. And these documents are available at special collections at the Hill Memorial Library at LSU. It's a totally fantastic set of sources. And so today, these documents allow us to catch a glimpse of the complexity and intensity of the suffrage debates of the 1910s. And I also want to point out here that both men and women advocated pro and anti-suffrage positions. So I often find, especially with my students, they assume that it was, the pro-suffrage people was only women and that the anti-suffrage people was only men. When in fact, you have very vocal, all women's groups who are anti-suffrage, who do not want, women who do not want the right to vote. And then you also had men who were pro-suffrage. So you'll get, people on all sides. So we are now going to start with our pro-suffrage. Let's see. Oops. Yes. Okay, here we go. We're going to start with our pro-suffrage arguments. So one major category of argument was rooted in women's contributions to the war. As a quick reminder, World War I was fought from 1914 to 1918, and the United States was involved in the war, or we had troops in the war from 1917 to 1918. So one constituent wrote to Senator Gay, "Women have played such an important part in the affairs of the country during the war that I feel confident you will wish to grant them the privilege of voting in the affairs of their country as well as yours." And this person further noted that some European nations had already given women the right to vote, and that it was those nations, rather than the United States, who were leaders in the interpretation of democracy. Oop. Wait, what's going on here? Okay. Another wrote that enfranchising women was, quote, a necessary war measure, and as a measure of simple justice to the women who have made sacrifices as great as any men have made during this period of war. So this was a question about the nation, about our ideals of democracy, and recognizing what women had done for the country during wartime. Another major argument was that women were equal citizens and should be treated as such. So here I'm showing you an example of a flyer that was created by the Equal Suffrage Association of North Carolina. And you'll see across the top, it says women are citizens and wish to do their civic duty. So working women, they wrote, they need the ballot to regulate the conditions under which they worked. Housekeepers need the ballot to regulate sanitary conditions under which they and their families live. Mothers need the ballot to regulate the moral conditions under which their children would be brought up, and so on and so forth. Now, the last two, housekeepers and mothers, I think is very interesting because it's a twist on this belief that women belonged in the home, in that private sphere. So they're reinforcing the idea that women do in fact belong in the home, right? They're not threatening gender roles in any way, but to effectively maintain that home and protect that home, women needed access to the vote. Another poster that was similar to this one said, the place of women is in the home, but staying in the home was not enough. She needed to care for the health and welfare, moral as well as physical, of her husband and her children, and therefore she needed the vote. So some of the letters that came into Senator Gay advocated this position. Another major argument in the South, but also that had appeal in the North, was that women needed the vote to maintain white supremacy. And this was often articulated through white women's support of the Democratic Party. Senator Gay, like every elected official in the South at the time, was a Democrat. At the time, the Democratic Party in the South was the party of white supremacy and Jim Crow. So as a reminder, it was members of Lincoln's Republican Party who called for the abolition of slavery and ultimately did just that with the passage of the 13th Amendment in 1865. The Democrats, on the other hand, had upheld the interests of the white slaveholding elite. And as a reminder, the Civil War was fought from 1861 to 1865. So obviously the makeup of the Republican and the Democratic parties 100 years ago are virtually, there's nothing like the makeup of the parties today, right? I mean, that was a 100-year-long process of shifting in those parties. So anyway, the argument was that white Democratic women would help support democratic control of the South and the nation. And in making those arguments about supporting the Democratic Party, it would have been very clearly understood at the time as supporting white control and white supremacy. A woman who was aligned with the Democratic Party wrote to Senator Gay, "Justice to our party demands that the Democratic women of the South be given the ballot. Many of the northern states," she continued, "have granted their women presidential suffrage that can only mean that there will be a large Republican woman's vote. And how are we Southern women to help you Southern men if you won't let us?" So of course, Southern women in this context is white women. Another woman wrote that by voting against the amendment, you are, quote, helping to defeat the Democratic Party. So in other words, to maintain conditions as they were in the South, to maintain white supremacy, women needed the vote. They also said this in plain English. So this is a flyer that was produced by the Equal Suffrage Association of North Carolina. That was the group that had produced the flyer about women as equal citizens. So here, their flyer reads, you see straight across the top, it says women's suffrage and white supremacy in the South. They're not even trying to mince words here. So here they write, the federal suffrage amendment will not affect the Negro situation in the South. The same qualifications will apply to Negro women as now apply to Negro men. And so the Negro situation that they're talking about is that by the early 1900s, despite the fact that you have the 15th Amendment, and the 15th Amendment said that voting could not, the right to vote or suffrage could not be denied on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And that was passed in 1870. So Black men theoretically had the right to vote. By the early 1900s, Black men in the South, despite this amendment, were fully disenfranchised. And this is a process that happened over time. So I'll give you an example from Louisiana. In 1894, 130,000 Black men were registered to vote. But as a result of poll taxes, literacy tests, violence, threats of violence, by 1904, 10 years later, only 1,342 Black men are eligible to vote. So this is not a coincidence, right? This was planned, this happened for a reason. It's not like black men just decided they didn't want to vote anymore. So over a 10-year period, you go from 130,000 to 1,300 Black men able to vote in the South. So basically what this group is then saying is, Black men were effectively kept away from the polls in the South, Black women would be too. So there's no concern here with giving women the right to vote. So to recap some of these pro-suffrage arguments, and of course there were more, I'm just giving you a sample. Women should be granted the right to vote because they had earned it through their contributions to the war effort. They were equal citizens and needed the vote to protect the home and their families, and that they, i.e. white women, were essential to maintaining the power of the Democratic Party and therefore white supremacy in the South. Okay, so now we're going to turn to some anti-suffrage arguments. A major anti-suffrage argument was that women did not belong in politics. This was a very, very pervasive argument that a lot of women agreed with at the time as well. Now, this idea, this idea was that women belonged in the home. They belonged in the private sphere, and politics in the public sphere was the world of men. So one constituent wrote, the men should not burden the women with the cares and vexations incident to political life. Politics was for men. This was men's world, not for women. And the dangers of engaging women in politics were many. Fears were rampant of what would happen to the home should women be allowed to vote. Gender roles would be completely overturned, chaos would reign, men would come home to an empty house with crying babies because their suffragist wife was out fighting for women's equality. And these are two political cartoons exactly showing this. So on the left, you see America when feminized. So you have your hen, and she's wearing her votes for women sash, right? So my country calls me. And then you have the rooster who's like, but wait, who's going to take care of the eggs, right? This political cartoon on the right is actually a cartoon from England, but it's just so perfectly encapsulates this argument. So you have the working husband who's just come home to find, the wife is gone. You can see the votes for women. So clearly she's a suffragist. The child is crying, the baby is on the floor, the house is a disaster. So this is a really interesting flip of the argument that women needed the vote to protect the home. Instead, what these folks are arguing is that actually women having the vote will endanger the home. So it's interesting the way the two camps use the home, and what happens to the home is central to their arguments, depending on how they flip it. Another major argument against the vote would be that it would threaten white supremacy in the South. So this is, again, fascinating because protecting white supremacy was one of the reasons that many people argued that women should get the vote. But in this case, you're seeing it flipped around and they're saying women should not get the vote because it endangers white supremacy. One constituent wrote to Senator Gay, the vote, quote, does not safeguard conditions that you and I well know prevail in the South. As long as I remember conditions put upon us just after the Civil War, I shall never consent to any abridgment of the power of the states to regulate suffrage. So those conditions that prevail in the South, again, here they're speaking to Black political, economic, and social disfranchisement, so white domination and Black oppression. And what this person means by the conditions put upon us just after the Civil War, this is when the federal government took control of the South and amongst other things, demanded that Black people, well, and really Black men, had a measure of access to political, economic, and social equality. So that included the 15th Amendment, again, which gave Black men said you could not deny the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So this is really a states' rights argument that this person is making. The Georgia Association opposed to women's suffrage. This was an all women's group. They wrote that women's suffrage would be a great menace to the South. In 66 counties in Georgia, Negroes outnumber whites in some 10-1. Citing the example of New York, the author of this letter, Mrs. Caroline Patterson, wrote that the imposition of women's suffrage there, quote, opened the way to forces hostile to our institutions. So here, the real concern, again, is that Black women would be able to access the vote, and therefore white supremacy would be endangered because they would vote against the Democratic Party. And then here is just a flyer, again, promoting that position that, should women have access to the vote, and including Black women, right? This is going to be very much challenge to white supremacy. So in some ways, actually, these white supremacists were right. Giving women the right to vote could threaten white supremacy. There were Black women's suffrage associations, and Black women were very much invested in the right to vote at this time. And from their perspective, many Black women did see the vote as a means to fight back against Jim Crow. This is a political cartoon here. So you see a Black woman with a club. It says federal constitution, like a club or a bat. And it's hitting, she's hitting Jim Crow law, segregation, which are synonymous. She's fighting back against Jim Crow. So that Black women indeed were ready to use the ballot to defeat Jim Crow and white supremacy. This is a political cartoon by a Black artist, John Henry Adams. And what's really interesting about this cartoon actually is that it originally appeared in The Crisis, which was published by the NAACP. And originally the caption said, "Women to the rescue." So it didn't explicitly address women's suffrage originally. It was later reprinted as a handbill with that added caption at the bottom, what votes for women means to the South, so that women's suffrage as embedded in the federal constitution would therefore work in the service of dismantling Jim Crow and white supremacy. Okay, so I'm going to wrap it up now. So when we're looking at the battle for women's suffrage, we really want to consider what the vote meant for people. The question of women voting was about gender and gender roles and people's fears around the stability of gender. What did it mean to be a man? What did it mean to be a woman? And what did it mean if women started voting, which was traditionally a men's task? What would happen to the home if women behaved like men and got involved in politics, right? And that's a big scare quotes around behaved like men. The question of women voting was also very deeply about race and racial caste systems, and about white people's fears around the stability of that system and Black people's desires to break down that system. So I have a few images here. We have in the top left, that's the members from the National Women's Party picketing the White House. This was very controversial. They picketed from April of 1918 through, I think, June of 1919. This was incredibly controversial. Oh, no, they started picketing in February But the United States entered the war in April and they continued picketing. So it was very controversial for them to be picketing a wartime president. You see on the right of that upper right-hand corner, some of their banners, Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty? Then the bottom left, we demand an amendment to the United States Constitution enfranchising women. Again, that's from the National Women's Party. Their colors were yellow and purple, not unlike LSU. And then the bottom right corner, you have Ida B. Wells Barnett, who was the leading and the founder of the anti-lynching crusade in the late 19th century in the United States. And at the time, she lived in Chicago. So she marched in the 1913 suffrage parade in Washington, D.C. with the Illinois contingency. And what's interesting about this photo is originally the Black women were told they had to march at the back of the parade. Because they didn't want, the white suffragist leaders did not want to upset the white suffragists of the South. And so they wanted Black women to march at the back of the parade. But Ida B. Wells was like, oh no, absolutely not. And as the parade rolled by, she joined the Illinois contingency and marched with them. So it's just kind of a really cool story. Okay, so I'm gonna stop my screen share now. And then I'm going to open it up for Q&A. So if anybody has any questions, I'd be very happy to answer those or have a conversation. And people can just chime in or raise their hands, but yes, Elizabeth Collins.
Can you say the part again about how, let's see, it was like people who were non-compos mentis, which means like not capable of proper thought. It's like a term for insanity or either that or cognitive disability. It was like people from women from Puerto Rico or non-compos mentis. What was that one again?
No, that was for Native Americans. So I'm just looking it up here.
For guardians of the state.
That's right. Yeah, because they're under the guardianship of the government. So essentially they're wards of the state. So as they're being protected by the state, then they are not themselves able to vote.
But there were three things grouped together: the non-compos mentis, women who were indigenous.
Yeah, so basically no person, I'm reading the exact quote, no person under guardianship, non-compos mentis, or insane. So it's kind of redundant because those kind of mean the same thing, right? Non-compos mentis.
Except for indigenous women. Like, it's like, wow, that's really telling right there that they put a grouping together of women under the guardianship of the state by virtue of their origin. Also those who are non-compos mentis.
Yeah, it's kind of intense, right? Yeah, because the idea, right? I mean, essentially Native Americans were, totally infantilized. I mean, they're seen as children, right? They can't think for themselves. They're being protected. They're under the guardianship of the state.
Sure.
Or,
right.
Yeah.
And so Native Americans got the vote in the, what did you say, the 40s?
Yeah, it depends. So like Arizona and New Mexico, it's 1948. But for many folks in many states, it's not until the Voting Rights Act of 1965, because the Voting Rights Act prohibited racial discrimination. So that's going to apply obviously to Black folks, but it's also going to apply to Native Americans, Latinos, et cetera, et cetera. So when all those voting laws, like those racially discriminatory voting laws, were prohibited and lifted, that's also going to impact the voting laws that prohibited Native folks.
I think that probably, I mean, this is a guess, but 1948 is a significant year because it's the end of the Second World War. And so like the Navajo code talkers were really pivotal.
Yeah.
In that push. So it's like when they came back, they had some capital to push back.
Yeah, you're absolutely right about that, because those lawsuits that people were launching throughout the West, where it was exactly one of the major arguments was the Navajo code talkers and everything they had done for their country, and then they come back and they're not allowed to vote. So it's really, I think the wartime context really fueled a lot of the legal arguments, and also probably similar to women's suffrage, The same way it was, women contributed to this war effort, we should give them the right to vote. I'm sure some of the similar arguments were made too, particularly when you think about the Navajo, but other indigenous folks who fought in the war.
Yeah, the obligation to fight. At some point, there's like a reciprocity in an ability to vote.
Exactly. And also think about so you can enlist me as a soldier in your war, but I'm still under your guardianship and I don't have the mental capacity to vote for myself. Like, what is that? Right. I think, following, the war, that was probably a pretty convincing argument.
Isn't that why the voting age went from 21 to 18 during Vietnam?
Probably. I'm not 100% sure, but that sounds right to me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to lower my hand now and just sit down.
Yes. Pipe down.
Thank you kindly.
Yes. Other questions? Or responses? I mean, what did you all think? Had you ever heard this before? Were you surprised about the pro-suffrage arguments, not surprised, or about the anti-suffrage arguments? Do you want me to just keep talking for 20 minutes? No, I'm just kidding. Any questions or comments? Yes, Chandler, hello.
Hi. So I guess my question, because you talked a bit about the difference in party politics around it,
Mm-hmm.
kind of thing. How much in doing like historical research you can really base on that? Like if you find women that were Democrats, you can't really assume they were anti-suffrage or vice versa.
Yeah, no, I don't think there's a linear connection there, right? I mean, I'm sure there was probably plenty of Republican women who were also anti-suffrage,
Mhm.
and maybe some Democratic women who were pro-suffrage. But what I think is interesting is how that argument gets wielded in the service of white supremacy. So that women are saying these women, clearly these women were of the Democratic Party who were writing to Senator Gay. So they're saying, look, we need to help support the party. So you need to give us the vote. But I don't think there's an automatic connection. But I would, because I think a lot of Democratic women might also argue the anti-suffrage side that says we need to protect the party and white supremacy, and therefore we shouldn't give the vote to Black women. So it's more about it's less about Democratic Party being anti or pro, and it's more about using the arguments to protect white supremacy. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think because most of my research focuses outside of the South,
Yeah.
People directing me politically, I
Yeah.
didn't think we're doing it well.
Yeah. I just, I find those arguments too about white supremacy so totally fascinating, the way they spin them in both ways. And I think maybe less so now, but that is, I think maybe 20 years ago or even 10 years ago, or I don't know, maybe even 5 years ago, when people talked about the suffrage movement, that's kind of like the deep, dark secret. We don't talk about that. We don't talk about, the racism of the suffrage movement. And the suffrage movement was incredibly racist, right? There are a lot of women who fought really hard for the vote, but they were racist. It doesn't make them bad people, but they had pretty bad understandings of race and racial caste systems. And it doesn't discount the work that they did, but we have to be honest about that history and how racism was wielded in the struggle for the vote in fairly horrifying ways.
With what's going on right now in terms of this pandemic, was the suffrage movement also sort of challenged when the Spanish flu came around?
Ooh, that is such a good question, Chandler. I have no idea. I have no idea. I have to look into that. That's a great question. Yeah.
Well, thank you. I was
Yeah.
excited for this, and I'm glad that I came, even though I was late.
Me too. I really appreciate you being here. When on Facebook, you're like, I'm so excited. I was like, great. Chandler over here.
Yes.
Anastasia, you are on mute, but your hand is raised. There you are.
Hi, I'm wondering how you got access to the letters and also to the cartoons.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the letter, so I'm a professor at LSU, so they're in the special collections at LSU. And it was actually one of the archivists there because I was teaching a women's history class. And so he had told me about these letters and he had pulled a bunch of them. So he actually kind of made my job a little easy for me. So he had given me like a ton of these letters. There's a lot more, I just picked a sample for you guys. So that's how. So, hug your local librarians, hug your local archivists, because they do amazing work and they make our jobs as professors a lot easier. And then those political cartoons, honestly, a lot of them, I found stuff in textbooks and stuff, but a lot of them I find from Google searches. I mean, there's just so much on the web. So I've been able, just doing like pro-suffrage arguments or like pro-suffrage flyers, and you do an image search and a lot of this stuff will come up. So it is really cool because you don't necessarily need to be like an academic or have access to academic resources, because so much of those resources are available on the web. So that's how I found a lot of, or how I found some of them. Yeah.
Super, thank you.
Yeah. Rachel Fisk.
Hi, this is not strictly speaking about suffrage, but I'm curious about, you mentioned Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln was a Republican, and sort of over the arc of time, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party have kind of switched. And I'm wondering if currently you see anything like that happening, or how you would characterize it, because when I look at it, to me, it seems like in at least my circle of people that I know or read about, Democrats are highly educated and Republicans seem like the people who would have like populated the unions maybe back in like the 60s. And I'm just wondering what that like is this just like what from a historical perspective, how political parties evolve like that, and do you see that happening now?
Yeah, well, first I would say that you have highly educated people in both parties. And also like, cause sometimes my I'll talk about the Republican and the Democratic Party of the 19th century and then the Republican Democratic Party today. People will be like, oh, well, the Republicans sound a lot more like the Democrats back then. But that's kind of like, it's dangerous to kind of think they just kind of flipped, because it was such, as you said, Ray, and as I said, like, this is over a 100-year process of the changing of the parties, or the makeup of the parties, of the beliefs of the parties, the motivations, the goals, and all of that. So even like today's Republican Party literally looks nothing like Reagan's Republican Party. So I think the parties are always shifting over time. It's just, I think it's probably hard to see it when we're living in it, because that change tends to be sometimes very gradual. So, and you have a lot of different shifts, like a lot of folks moved from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party beginning in the 1960s over the issue of civil rights. Because as the Democratic Party starts taking on civil rights, like Lyndon B. Johnson was a Democrat, and he supports civil rights. Well, a lot of the Democrats in the South are not happy with that. So, they have like their own wing called the Dixiecrats, but then a lot of those folks moved into the Republican Party. Then in the 1970s, you have the rise of the new right and this new Christian conservatism that essentially, I don't know if I want to say takes over the Republican Party, but, the Christian conservatives wed themselves, and then, the rise of the evangelical new right wed themselves to the Republican Party. So it's another shift, that you see happening in the 80s. So I don't know. I mean, everybody, like right now, it just seems, and I'm not a political scientist, so I don't know that I have a very good answer about the parties will continue to shift over time. I mean, historically they have, so it seems likely, but it seems like right now everybody's pretty entrenched and digging their heels and where they stand. So I don't know what the future holds, but hopefully people will use reason and sound judgment and use facts and evidence when drawing their conclusions. That would be my hope as a historian.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thanks.
Thanks for your question. Thanks for tuning in.
You're welcome.
Any other questions or comments? Elizabeth Collins.
Well, I'm a typical academic, so I don't have a question. I just want to talk.
About yourself and your research?
Yes, well, my research says, no, I'm actually painting right now. So, well, as I think about this, like that language in the 19th Amendment, we all think it gives a right a positive thing, and instead it's a negative thing. It's like we cannot deny on the basis of X. It really makes me think about things like negative liberty, right? The right to not be discriminated against because of X, but it doesn't really say you have a positive right. Like, I was horrified as a historian when I learned that we have no right to privacy. If you look at our Constitution, nowhere does it say anything about that. And then I think about Roe versus Wade, and we think that that gave women the right to an abortion, but it gave doctors, you know this, you can finish my sentence.
Right.
It gave doctors the right to perform abortions in the first trimester, in the second trimester under certain conditions, and almost never in the third trimester.
Yeah.
So I think about like the ways that we talk about suffrage. And I love what you said at the very beginning of this. This story is a story of disfranchisement. Or is it disenfranchisement?
Disfranchisement.
Yes, thank you. That was a test.
Thank you. I
But
passed.
you passed because I can't recall.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's an awkward word. But disfranchisement is a very important way to look at the story because, I don't know, do you have any thoughts you want to share about, like, let's just say today or Georgia or Michigan or the 2020 election, as a historian, your views on disfranchisement and some things we should look for?
Well, I really appreciate what you said, is that, you know, the history of the vote in this country is a history of disfranchisement, right? I think a lot of people think like, oh, it's enshrined in the Constitution that, you know, voting is a right that all citizens should have. It's absolutely not in the Constitution, right? I mean, there used to be property requirements to vote, right? So marginalized people, right? And poor white people included, minoritized groups, people of color, right? All of those people have been kept away from the polls because the people in power, which tend to be moneyed white men, right, have a vested interest in keeping those folks away from the polls. And that's why the 1965 Voting Rights Act was so revolutionary, because when Black people are able to vote, when poor people are able to vote, when Native Americans are able to vote, they're going to vote for their constituents, you know, people who look like them, who represent their values, their lives, who are going to support their life experiences. And so once the electorate changes, then the people who are in power starts to change, right? So you're going to get Black representation in the government again for the first time, especially in the South, since the Reconstruction era, right after the Civil War, right? More and more women are in political positions, right? And women of color too. So yeah, and so voter denial, disfranchisement is a huge problem in our country right now. It was a huge problem in this election. There's this idea of voter fraud, which is just completely inaccurate, and there's no evidence. There's like literally zero evidence for it. In fact, there was a study that was done, I think of the 2016 election, and out of the, I don't know how many, 120 million ballots that were cast. I don't remember exactly the numbers. Maybe it's closer to 140, whatever. They found literally 2,000 cases of voter fraud. That's it, right? Out of 120 million. So, this whole idea that we have voter fraud right now, which is, the rhetoric of the Republican Party, is totally false, and there's no evidence to support that. What there is evidence to support, however, is voter suppression, and incredible amounts of voter suppression. And so people not being able to access the polls, poll sites being moved far away, polling locations being shut down or being moved far away from particular communities, typically Black communities, poor communities. So voter suppression is very real. And you also see, this is kind of a long answer, but the Voting Rights Act in 2013, the Supreme Court essentially gutted the Voting Rights Act. And there's a section of that act which says if any jurisdiction wants to change their voting laws in any way, they have to get the approval of the the federal government to do that. And the reason that was put in the Voting Rights Act is because after the Voting Rights Act was passed, literacy tests were abolished, all of these racial discriminatory laws were abolished. So they put in this section that says, if you want to make any more changes, you need to pass it by us. Because, you know, you might be able to get rid of literacy tests, but then what else would the white South come up with to keep Black folks away from the polls, right? So they had to put in this additional section. Well, what happened is that only certain jurisdictions required pre-clearance. And these were areas that had historically discriminated against, people in voting. And so what the Supreme Court said was that the formula that's used for the deciding who needed pre-clearance was no longer valid. So if that formula is no longer valid, then nobody is subjected to pre-clearance anymore. So since 2013, the case is Shelby v. Holder. Since 2013, voter suppression has absolutely skyrocketed because all these different jurisdictions have now changed their voting laws. They haven't been under the watch of the federal government. And so it's been a huge problem. And this is something I'm always trying to tell my students. I'm like, y'all are the young people, I'm too old. You have to be out there and battling in the street and do this. But like voting is like a serious social justice issue of our time, for sure.
Well, I think your op-ed for the New York Times is already written.
Perfect. I hope you took notes so I can just send it.
I'll send them to you.
Okay.
And yeah, it's really like as historians, we think about continuity and change, like what's changed over time and what has remained the same. And your talk tonight about women's suffrage really reinforces that truth that voter suppression has been part of the American tradition.
Absolutely, 100%.
And that some of the things that have been faced in the past just are reiterated in new forms.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks. So I do want to be respectful of everybody's time, and we're a few minutes past the hour. So unless there are any last questions, I think we are going to wrap it up. Oh, yes, Mildred.
Am I muted?
No, I can hear you now.
I would like to thank you for your presentation, and also Chris at the library. The Ascension Parish Library has done an outstanding job, in my opinion, during this pandemic, offering Zoom courses on many, many topics. So thanks to Chris and the staff, and thank you for your presentation tonight.
Yeah, Mildred, thank you so much. And I want to thank everybody who is here listening for tuning in. I know it's kind of awkward on Zoom, but I think as Mildred said, it's really nice to have these connections during the pandemic. And yeah, absolutely, the Ascension Parish Library is doing amazing work, as all public libraries do. So I wasn't joking when I said hug your local library, and not now. But once we have a vaccine, appreciate your libraries, support them, donate to them. And yeah, so thank you, Chris, for all the good work that y'all are doing over there at the library. And thanks again for inviting me. This was really fun.
Thank you. It's absolutely our pleasure to host. Obviously a fantastic presentation. I know I speak for everybody when I give you my most sincere thanks for giving us your time and energy. Very, very educational and entertaining. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you everyone for joining us. I see Dr. Jacquet just posted her email address. So if anyone would like to contact her, it is cjacquet@lsu.edu.
Yeah.
Of course, the library is more than happy to do everything that we can for the community. And this was such an important anniversary that we were very glad to get Dr. Jacquet to come out and perform for us all the way from Montreal.
That's right.
So
that's the beauty of
yeah.
Zoom, right? You don't have to be in the same state or the same country, and we can start the conversation.
So thank you all again for coming tonight. Keep an eye out on our Facebook and for our newsletter for other presentations that we'll be hosting. And again, a very, very special thanks to Dr. Jacquet.
Yeah, totally my pleasure. Thank you so much. Bye, everybody. Thanks for
Thank you all
joining.
so much.